All right, break's over. We're going to get right back to it. We have heard from a few folks who are having trouble with the document size, which we tried PDFing and zipping for them. So it will be posted if you were unable to get it in your email. So we'll get that posted before the week is out, I hear. This is what my staff said, before the week is out, this will be posted. So actually we can probably get it done by midweek, huh? Thursday? Okay. So we're going to start back on with how do you get paid? We know you want to listen in on this part. Wendy is going to start it off. And then Brandon Davison is going to take over, and then I'll talk a little bit. So we're going to tag team you on this one.
Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about just the general invoicing. In your agreement, your invoices are going to be due quarterly with your quarterly reports. Once they are complete and sent into the grant manager and they don't have any questions, it'll go back and it'll go between the grant manager and the program analyst. It'll go through a fiscal unit. It goes to our accounting office. It heads over to the state parks who's doing our bond coordinating. And then it comes back over and goes over to state controllers. So this process you're looking at right now can take 45 days. It should only take 45 days once we have a complete invoice package. It goes through quite a few steps so you can see why it takes 45 days. If anything is wrong once you submit your invoice, let's say your numbers carried forward are incorrect, your backup documentation is not complete, the grant manager has any questions, or your program analyst has any questions, we're going to issue what's called a dispute. You could either receive a form or an email that will stop the clock, and then the 45 days will start over again once the grant manager or program analyst has a complete invoice package. Once your invoicing has gotten through to the end and your final invoice is submitted, or once you've received 90% of your grant amount, we're going to hold your invoices for the last 10% until we receive all the deliverables and your grant manager is very happy with your project. So we're not going to keep 10% of every invoice. You're going to submit complete 100% costs to be reimbursed, and then once we reach 90%, we're going to hold that last invoice or the last couple invoices until your project is complete. When we send you your grant agreement, your fully executed grant agreement, along with that is going to be your invoice template. This is the form that has to be submitted with your invoices. This is the one that will go through that process we just talked about, that will go over to state controllers to be paid. This template has to be created by your program analyst. It will not, you cannot make any changes to it except adding your current expenditures. Is that all I wanted to say about that? If any changes to your budget happen, your program analyst will do a new invoice template. It always has to come from your program analyst. Nothing can, in the state use only, cannot be changed, or it's going to trigger a dispute and your invoice is going to be delayed. Any questions on that? Brandon.
Hi folks, I'm Brandon Davison. I'm a grants manager for the DFA. So I'm going to jump back just a couple as well to get back to this one to mention about our invoicing. So you as the grantee are responsible for implementing your project, so the expenditure of public funds is made in accordance with the state and federal rules and regulations, and therefore the grantee must establish and maintain financial management controls and accounting procedures to track their grant and match funding. You must provide adequate documentation to support the expenditures of funds, and you must maintain an auditable file of records for the entire term of the project. So as Wendy had pointed out, there is the process that you will turn in your invoicing deliverables. Starting from you, the grantee, you will collect your invoicing information, turn it to your grant manager, and from there it will go through a process through the state water boards and additional entities to get to you. So here we've seen the invoice template. So your program analyst will send an electronic version of this invoice template. You will also get an invoice submittal summary sheet and the grantee labor certification form, which I will show you here shortly. And what we would like to see on this invoice template is that you will number your invoices sequentially and include the time period as set out in our executed agreement, which is typically on a quarterly level. You will our invoice should reflect the changes for the reporting period and support the work that is described in the progress report for the same reporting period. We will cover progress reports here shortly. And also your invoices are submitted to the grant manager and must have the original signature of your project director or someone delegated by your director on the project director certification form, which we had seen earlier in our presentation. So some of the supporting documentations that we would like to see are going to provide the basis for maintaining an auditable file by properly accounting for bond, federal, and matching funds. So some of the things that we would like to see are your contractors and consultant invoices, which may come from professional consultation services, from construction teams, from laboratories, etc. We would like to see your grantee personnel hours. To properly document personnel hours, we're going to use a grant labor certification form, which I will show you shortly. And you'll also want to document your materials, so including office expenses, invoices for items listed under your line items on your invoice template, which may also include things like equipment costs. And for our format for submitting, we're going to have an invoice submittal summary sheet, which is this fella right here. So notice that we would like to see, this is essentially an Excel spreadsheet that we'll send out with your particular project line item categories, so direct project costs, planning, design, engineering, equipment, etc. We'd like to see those broken down numerically that would line up with your invoice summary, with your roll-up invoicing, and your submitted invoices to be reimbursed. So notice we have broken things out in who they are, when they're being paid, how much your match amount is going to be, and if there's any particular comments, like you needed to submit something a little later than you had anticipated, or as if there may be some monies removed from a particular receipt or invoice, you could actually have a spot to put some comments to alert your grant manager and your program analyst to those particular nuances about your submission. And here we have another page just showing the same summary sheet with additional categories. And then here is a copy of our labor certification form, which you can find in our program director guide that was just newly established or reinvigorated. And so notice we have some category breakdown, employee names with classifications of what jobs are being done, the total hours on the project, hourly billing rates, etc. So these will also need to be submitted when you turn in your invoicing. And from that point on, I'm going to turn it over to Laura McLean, unless there's any questions. And that's a no. Great, thanks.
All right, thank you, Brandon. So we're going to talk a little bit about eligible and ineligible cost. And before we go there, well, no, I'll circle back around. We'll go directly to the eligible and ineligible cost. So the types of costs you're going to be asking for reimbursement for will be things like your personnel hours. This could include admin hours to prepare an invoice and the proper documentation that goes with it, volunteer hours that you would like to put into match, and those can be done in a labor certification type format, consulting and contractors invoices, and any supplies and materials that are directly related to the project. So don't run out and buy new office chairs and computers. They're not likely to be considered directly related to this project. And that brings us to the ineligible cost. So some of the common things that we see are things such as markup or a surcharge, a per diem or out-of-state travel, tuition fees, stuff just plainly labeled overhead, and the grant law or bond law plainly says we can't cover your overhead. Deductibles for insurance, food and beverage, audit costs, legal cost, with some exceptions if you're talking about easements for property directly associated with the project, that might be appropriate, but you'd need to talk with your grant manager. And for this bond law, no land purchases can be included in match or reimbursement. So that brings us, I'll give you a couple examples in a minute, but one of the things I wanted to make sure you understood is if it's not eligible for reimbursement, it's not eligible for match. So sometimes in the past, match has been the garbage category, we like to call it. And we've drawn the line now, and we want it to be very clear. If it wasn't an eligible reimbursement cost, it's not going to be an eligible match cost. We have also added, I'm going to go back to our template, and we've added an equipment line item, and that wasn't in the budget detail that we sent to you, but we will need that from you. Any equipment over $5,000 needs to be called out specifically. In that, along that vein, I want to make sure you understand that you should not purchase equipment without talking to your program analyst and or grant manager, or both. We will need to verify that it is appropriate for this project and necessary, and that you've done the proper procurement process, whatever that might be, before we would approve the purchase. So we've had grantees switch the item they were going to purchase and surprise us with a $100,000 bill for something, or go out and buy new computers for their office and wonder why we couldn't reimburse them. Please don't do that. Ask first, and then we can have a discussion and find out if it's justified, and we can relate it directly to the project. And that's really brings us to why we're doing this. We really want to make sure that the invoicing process will go smoothly for you and for us. We don't want to keep stopping the clock on you, because you know there's that 45 days on the back end. So my little mantra, my staff love this, is when in doubt, leave it out. If you don't think it's an eligible cost, I'll bet it's probably not. So there are a number of things that people frequently will include, and I'm going to go back to a couple of examples that we see. Okay, so here's a line item. You may or may not see it. For you, those of you who do not have the actual presentation, you're trying to read it on the computer screen. What this line item calls out is a per diem. It's $1,700 and some per diem. There's no explanation and there's no breakout. We don't pay per diem like that. So what we need to be able to do is verify that the per diem did not exceed any of the state rates that we're allowed to pay for mileage, for meals, for hotel rooms. So if we see a per diem show up like this, if you haven't provided a breakout and justification, we won't pay it. If the auditor sees it and I missed it, they're going to take it back out and ask you to pay it back. Okay? So this isn't just our rule. It's one of those things the auditors find and they go, did they follow the state rate rules? How do we know? Where's the justification for this? The same thing with out-of-state travel. Most of you should not have any out-of-state travel. You should find somebody in-state to do the work. Seriously. So if you've got to bring somebody in, that's a discussion that you should be having right now with your grant manager to make sure we're going to consider that eligible. Okay? So I think in general, if it's any gray area, either leave it out or call the grant manager before you do your final totals. It's going to save you and us a lot of time. Just check in with us. Another item we frequently see is just a percentage markup on top of everything. We're not against profit, but that's just strictly overhead when we look at it and when the auditor looks at it. We're not saying that the firms that you hire can't mark up their subcontracts. We're just saying we won't pay for it. So I want to be very clear about the difference. We're not saying it's wrong. We're just saying under this grant program we can't pay for it, okay? So the standard, in particular, we see things like on top of your personnel hours to cover office expenses. We'll just take it off. We won't pay it. So either let your consultants know that you can't have that, or just take it off, subtract it from their invoice total when you send it in to us. We're not trying to tell you what the consultants can and can't bill. We're trying to explain to you what we will and will not pay. Okay, that's the difference there. Okay, and then finally, we want to talk about the Audible File briefly. It is your responsibility to keep the auditable file. So what happens in the audit process is the auditor will come and randomly pick an invoice out of our file, but they're not going to look for us to have all the backup documentation. They're going to come to your office and your subcontractor's office and their subcontractor's office and make sure that the records match up with what was submitted to us. So it's in your best interest that you have a well-organized file. And one of the things that will help with that is if you have a well-organized invoice. So that actually brings me up to something else I wanted to mention. Brandon was talking about what we want to see submitted, and one thing I want to show you is on the supporting documentation, sometimes people will send us in an invoice and it's just loose. It's in no particular order, and we're just supposed to find our way through it. That's why we have this invoice summary sheet. Number the items submitted so that when you and I are talking about it, we have a question, I can just go, well, it was item number 3, this invoice submitted this date. We can go quickly down through that stack, find it. It's also nice when we're checking to make sure, yep, we got that, and that's the right amount. There's the right amount, there's the right amount. It's much faster, it's going to be easier for your record keeping as well as our record keeping. So we do want you to have a well-organized invoice submitted. So let's get back down. One of the other things is that if you have a line item change and the auditor can't find approval for it, that's the beginning of a loose thread they're going to pull until they get all the way to the end of it. So record keeping, and they're not going to come to me, or they might, but it's on you to have that file where each of your approvals is there and it's well organized. If you have more questions about that, we'd be glad to talk to you about it, because we don't want you to pay back some large chunk of funds 5 years after this grant ended, and I'm not in this job anymore, you're not in that job anymore. Some guy is sitting in that chair going, oh my gosh, I can't find any of this, I don't know where it is. The auditor just says, fine, pay it back. Okay? So, and then I wanted to put a plug in for the project director's guide. There's lots of good information in there. There's a sheet that gives you what information is supposed to be in that auditable file. I think you should always check the project director's guide certainly before you start reporting or invoicing. There's a lot of good information in there. And then call your grant manager up and verify, this is what I'm reading, does this seem correct to you? But it will save you a lot of heartache if you kind of get a grasp of, okay, this is the obligation I have with this grant funds. So, any questions?
Oh, yes, we have questions. For equipment purchases, we have one grantee who the majority of their cost is for equipment that the contractor will be purchasing. So do those costs have to be pulled out separately? This is for the trash TMDL project.
Yes. So what you'll do is before we can finalize the grant agreement, and I apologize, but I think this is an important addition to our grant agreement. You'll pull out the cost of any equipment that's over $5,000, and we'll have a separate category both on the invoice roll-up sheet and then on our supporting document sheet.
Okay.
So yeah, you're going to need to pull that cost out. You can give us kind of an estimate. You should have a pretty good idea if it's a large purchase, what it's going to cost you. So include that in there, and then if we have additional questions, we'll give you a call.
Okay, and then there's one, it's fairly long, and it's deals specifically with the PAP and tracking performance measures. Is it expected that existing baseline figures will be directly compared against equivalent figures after the improvements are made? For example, peak flow reduction. Would we need to know the downstream flows at a point in cubic feet per second prior to making the improvements for the first 3 storm events to compare with those measured following the wet season after the improvements?
If you're going to directly measure it, and that's how you're going to show your peak flow, then absolutely you're going to have a baseline. So if you're measuring your peak flow directly, then you're going to have a before project and an after project.
Okay, and then this one is dealing with the grant agreement scope of work. Will they be getting a blank one to fill in, or will they be to fill in for the applicant to do, or is the applicant expected to just be getting this information from the grant manager? So that was answered previously.
It was.
Yes, so they'll be getting a scope of work from your grant manager and program analyst.
You sent us your scope of work. So with your application. So what we're doing, our process, we've tried this a couple different ways, and now we're going to try it this way, where the grant manager is going to cull through that application and put together a scope of work that we think is appropriate in a grant agreement. Because what you have in your scope of work may not be, we obviously don't want that level of detail in the grant agreement. We want specific deliverables that we can measure progress with. And so we thought it would be best to have the grant manager take a crack at that. You will, of course, get to see it before you have to sign the agreement.
Okay, and for markup, the public works contractor time and material change orders typically have a markup. Would construction cost markups qualify for invoice, or should all change orders be negotiated costs?
So I think that if I've got this question right, I think we're talking about that contingency category you see often. We don't do contingencies, so anything that you send in to us should be a negotiated cost, not in that contingency category or labeled markup.
Yeah, and so there's a few that are contractor markup. Are they eligible for local match? So, yeah.
No, so again, if it's not eligible for reimbursement, it is not eligible for match. Okay, so that's a cost that you will have to pick up yourself.
Okay, the last one so far is if you have multiple items that for equipment that are approximately $1,000 to $1,500 each, but you're cumulatively purchasing more that are going to be over that 5,000 mark, does that have to be pulled out and put into the equipment cost?
No, but if you're purchasing equipment and your grant manager doesn't know about it, I don't care how much it is, you need to have a discussion with them to make sure that we think it's appropriate for this grant. So I can see somebody running out and purchasing 4 computers. None of them cost more than $5,000. Does that mean you shouldn't talk to us? No. Give us a call, but no, it doesn't have to be in the grant agreement. It's a piece of equipment that's over $5,000. Okay, so Wendy's given me extra notes here, and the reason is in the state contractors manual it says any equipment over $5,000 that we purchase, you're going to have to explain to us what happens after the grant ends. So we're going to, let's say that you purchase a piece of monitoring equipment that's very expensive, and we want to know that it doesn't, that the consultant doesn't have us buy the equipment and then go out and use it for 5 other projects. We could prorate the cost for you, or you could rent it, but we'd need to know ahead of time if that was an appropriate use of funds. That it'll stay, yeah, so we'll give you more direction on that, but yeah, there's some devils in the details there.
Okay, I think that's it for right now.
Okay, so up next, Ms. Kelly List.
Yes, please take that crap out of my way. Good morning. Like Laura said, my name is Kelly List, and I am a grant manager in the Stormwater Grant Program. And I'm going to be discussing the 3 main reports that we will be expecting you to submit as part of the grant. The emphasis of this presentation will be the progress report. That is going to be the first major report that you will have to submit as a grantee and part of this grant. And it will be the basis for the other 2 reports that I'll be discussing here towards the end. So these are the main categories that you'll be including in the progress report. Also the progress report template, and all of these reports that I'm discussing today you should have received from your grant manager on Friday, or from me if you have Danielle Siebel as your grant manager, as she is on vacation. But the main sections I'm going to discuss in the progress report will be in sections 2B, C, and D. Those are the areas that we will be looking at the most on a quarterly basis, and that's what we will discuss in further detail. So under a summary of work completed to date, this table should look very familiar to you. It's going to be in your grant agreement, and this is your deliverables table that we will be importing into your progress report. The main difference here, instead of having a critical date and an estimated due date, we are going to have % of work completed and dates submitted. So these dates here and the % work completed should match the other next sections that we'll discuss later. And the % complete should be an accurate representation of what you have completed thus far. So the introduction, you please write this as if the reader has no prior knowledge of your project. Summarize what you have included in your scope of work in the grant agreement. Paint a picture of your project for the reader. And for most of you, this part of this report will remain the same through the life of the grant. The only reason why this section would be changing is if for some reason your scope of work has changed in your grant agreement. So your summary of activities, this is the main part of the report. You need to summarize all of your major activities for the reporting period only. For most of you, or if not all of you, it will be for that quarter. We do not want you to describe work completed previously. We just want you to focus on what you did for that reporting period. And this must justify what you are invoicing us. So this is what the auditor is going to look at when comparing to your invoices for that quarter. So describe any issues or setbacks, how they were addressed, describe any monitoring or meetings or public outreach events that you did. In a paragraph form, describe the work completed on your deliverables so that we don't have to keep referring back to the next sections that I'll describe in a moment. But again, only describe what is reported during that reporting period. And this is the part that we will be looking at to justify your invoices. So make sure it's robust enough for us to feel comfortable signing your invoices. So your summary of items for review and the summary of items in progress, these two things are similar, but there's a little difference between them, and this is what it's going to look like. This is an example that I've prepared for you. So your summary of items for review, those are the items that you've completed for this quarter and that you have submitted them to the grant manager for their review and acceptance for that deliverable. it may not mean that you're going to have 100% complete of that item. For instance, your monitoring report, if you're doing quarterly reporting, your first monitoring report that you're submitting for your grant, it may only be 10 or 20% of that deliverable complete, but yet you're still submitting the item for review. You also need to put down a couple sentences describing the work that you completed on that deliverable. And, but don't spend a whole lot of time on it here. You need to describe it in that paragraph form that I discussed previously. And also your summary of items in progress, that is exactly what it is you've worked on this deliverable, but it's not complete, but you still need to describe what you did on those deliverables only in this reporting period. I've seen a lot of progress reports come in where they've just cumulatively written what they've done on these through the life of the grant. We just want to know what you've done this reporting period only. And then photographs, please, this is an implementation grant, so there should be before, during, and after photos. But you have to, don't just import photos into the document either. Please provide captions so that we understand what we're looking at in these photos. Also, you should somehow provide some kind of a documentation of any kind of meetings or outreach that you've done in the community to justify those costs as well. And if you have done a PowerPoint presentation, you don't have to include all of the slides. You can do just, the main, the title page, for lack of a better term. And but please don't submit to us the presentation 1 slide per page. If you're going to do the whole presentation, do 6 slides per page. We don't want to get 40 pieces of paper on a quarterly basis. So the annual and PAP update reports, we've now combined these 2 reports into one. The PAP status update reports tend to be forgotten. People would think that if they had nothing to update in their PAP, that the report was not necessary to provide to us, but it's still a necessary documentation to receive. So we thought if we combined these 2 into one, it would make it easier on everybody and nobody would forget them. So these are the basic sections that you will be filling out. Again, like I said, a template was submitted to you on Friday from your grant manager. If you did not receive that for some reason, as Laura said, some people's emails were not accepting our emails to you because the file sizes were too large. Please email your grant manager so that we can get those documents to you. So the background, we just want to know why was your project needed, the location of the project, what watershed it's in, and what the issues are. Your project description will describe how your project is going to fix that problem, and the status. Where are you in the project? What problems that you had? How was it addressed? And was there any kind of setbacks that you need to now work on your scheduling to update those? And then the PAP status update should include some of these questions here. And the staying on task, some people don't understand why that is important, but if for some reason your schedule has gone behind and you're not completing it on a timely manner, that might affect some of your targets. For instance, if you put in your PAP that you are going to monitor for 3 seasons, well, if you're running long on time and not able to make up that scheduling, then you have to shorten that monitoring seasons down to 2. So then obviously you have to update your PAP. But if you're getting to that point and you think that you're not going to be meeting all of your goals and targets, then you need to contact your grant manager immediately. And you should not be looking at your PAP on an annual basis. I would highly suggest when you're writing your quarterly progress reports to have your tables out in front of you so that you can, on a quarterly basis, monitor how you're doing there with your goals and your targets to see if you're going to still be able to meet them. So in the final project report, this is going to be something that everybody will prepare at the end of the grant. And I have it on here. It will be uploaded into FAST. FAST is a public search tool, so the public can look at this for an indefinite amount of time. So it will be the representation of your organization and your ability to complete a grant and use of state funds. So you need to justify and highlight any achievements that you've completed during this grant and tell us why it was a good use of state funds. So these are the main sections of the final project report. You know, we have a lot of sections here, but the main one that we really want to focus on is your project evaluation and effectiveness. Yes, you need to answer what was the problem and what was the solution, but was your project effective? That's really what we want to know. So we cannot stress the importance of whether you met your goals and targets of your PAP. You have to discuss that entire section in this report here. So it really makes a lot of sense if you were just to keep that PAP table in front of you when you're writing your progress reports on a quarterly basis, so that you will know whether you're going to have a good section here in this report at the end, because that will decide whether we think that you use the funds well or not. So do not think of this at the end of your grant. Put a lot of thought and effort into it. Put a lot of thought and effort into your progress reports, because it will help you with your final report at the end of the grant. And as Laura mentioned earlier, timing is key here. Your time management is important. So the final, the draft report should be submitted 2 to 3 months before the work completion date, which is March 1st? Yeah, March 1st of 2016. So 2 to 3 months prior to that, you should be submitting a draft copy of your final report into your grant manager. This final report then needs to be completed and approved by your grant manager prior to the work completion date. So there are often times where it can take months for a grant manager to get a final report in that they can accept and approve. Most of the time that when we're kicking back the final reports, it's because we received a 2 to 3 page description of what they completed. They did not discuss the PAP and whether they met their goals and targets. Photos were not included, before and after photos, and so we're having to kick these reports back repeatedly for simple things that should have been addressed in the beginning. So the more time and effort you put into this, the easier it will be at the end of the grant. So is there any questions? Jeff?
There is one question. It's not for reporting, though. It's going back to invoicing.
Yay.
Thanks, Kelly.
Do we need to submit supporting documentation for all matching costs? It is possible that an invoice may be submitted just for matching costs, since I guess the bulk of their grant is directed towards construction costs.
Absolutely. So when you submit your match, you'll submit it just like you submit your cost for reimbursement. We treat it the same. We review it the same, because, again, what's eligible for reimbursement is eligible for match, and we track it the same. So we track it, we review it, and you submit it. And frequently we will have people who are not asking us to reimburse them for their planning, design, or initial outlay, and that will show up in the match. So we might have a whole invoice or two that are just matched before they actually start construction and ask for reimbursement. Okay, so we have a little educational talk that Kim Sellards is going to give on the end, and I hope you guys pay very close attention to what Kim has to say. I'm sure you'll be enlightened.
Good morning, I'm Kim Sellards. I work in the Office of Enforcement here at the State Water Board. I have about 10 minutes this morning to talk to you about fraud, that's detecting fraud, and also the consequences of fraud. So I'm going to cover 3 topics today. The first one is what is fraud, and then we'll follow that up with identifying red flags. These are the things that we're looking for in our data sets that show us that there's a problem or that there might be a problem. And then finally, we're going to talk about what are the consequences of fraud, what do our investigations result in. Fraud is defined as a knowing misrepresentation of the truth or concealment of a material fact to induce another to act to his or her detriment. And simply put, in simple words, it's a lie or it's concealing the truth. So how common is fraud? This is a press release from the Office of Inspector General, and there's a quote from Mr. Joseph P. Rusinelio. He is a federal attorney, and he says, "We've come to realize that 10 to 15% of the federal funds expended are lost to fraud, waste, and or abuse." Now, this is not an anomaly for federal funds. This is not an anomaly of government funds. This is an industry standard. Now that we know that there is fraud, what can we do to identify this fraud? How can we find this fraud? Those inconsistencies in the data, or the things that we look for, are called red flags. My next 8 slides or so are invoices, documents, pictures that we've received here at the State Water Board, and hopefully you can see them. If not, I'm going to describe them in a little bit more detail than I typically would based on the comments we've been receiving about not being able to see the slides very well. This first one is a laboratory invoice that came in, and there are 10 words on it that are circled. Every one of these words that is circled is misspelled. This is an example of inconsistencies in data. This is a red flag. This is a form, a template, that this laboratory has been using probably for a number of years. So for there to be misspellings like this, there's a problem. Somebody made this up, or there's some other issue going on. This is an invoice submitted for quarterly groundwater monitoring, and the issue here is significant digits. You'll see that the consultant charged the state exactly $10,000 for performing this work. There's no breakdown of time materials, there's no breakdown of staff for how this work was conducted. This flat rate billing is an indicator of fraud. Altered documents. This is an invoice, and at the very top you'll see the vendor's name and their address, but you'll notice that there's no phone number or contact information for them. And that's pretty uncommon. If you've ever received an electric bill or a bill from a credit card company, you know that they're going to provide that type of contact information. If you're going to be late in a payment, if you're going to miss a payment, if you're going to dispute charges, they want you to be able to contact them. So that's a red flag that there's invoice missing from this information. Also at the very bottom you'll see a description of what the invoice is for, and it's for a 300 ECAT electrical catalytic oxidizer. That's a large piece of equipment. The total billed amount here is $49,500. But what's odd is that we're missing a serial number. When you pay $49,000 for a piece of equipment, it should have a serial number. If you buy a calculator that costs, $50, or you buy a small camera, it's going to have a serial number on it. So I contacted the manufacturer, and they were able to provide an original invoice. And this next slide is a copy of that original invoice. And you'll see at the top that it looks similar as far as the vendor's name and their address, but now there's a phone number and a fax number. And if you look farther at the description, you'll see that there's a serial number. The serial number here is C1115. And then even more interesting than that is if you look at the price. This piece of equipment actually costs $36,450, which is about $13,000 less than what was sent to the state. It's actually probably more common than you think for people to make up invoices or to alter invoices like this. Supporting documents or lack of supporting documents is another red flag. Here we have a groundwater monitoring that was conducted in February 2011. This is an invoice provided by the consultant where they've invoiced for a field technician for 13 hours and also for a field geologist for 13 hours. But there's no breakdown. We don't know the dates that were worked. We don't know the staff's name that performed this work. So when we do our audit and we request for timesheets, we don't always do an audit, but when we need to do an audit, we request timesheets, and there's no documentation that's going to be able to support these types of charges. We can't directly compare it to your timesheets and confirm that these charges are accurate. What about excessive costs? Excessive costs are a red flag. When something costs more than it seems like it should, that that's something that you should take notice of and look into further. This is an example where the consultant submitted an invoice to dispose of 1 drum of soil cuttings. And the disposal fee was $85.96. So that's what the disposal facility charged to handle the waste. But the consultant has now used 3 staff to perform this task for a total of 10 hours, and the bill is over $1,000. That's a substantial markup. Site visits are a really important way to see that what's going on in the field is what's actually in the invoices. If your consultant charges you to install 10 monitoring wells, take a look, go out in the field and see, can you find 10 monitoring wells on the ground? What about large equipment? Large equipment are some of the most expensive costs that we're going to see on projects that I've been looking at. And large equipment should have a serial number. On this piece of equipment in this picture, there's a black placard. And on the black placard you can see in this next picture that there's a serial number there, C1207. I can go back to the invoice that was submitted to the state and verify that what they charged us for is what's actually on site. Now, I'm going to tell you an example that I don't have a slide for. I went out to a site and they had a Curtis Thompson air compressor. And when I came back to the office, I recorded the serial number when I was there. When I came back to the office, I looked up the invoice, and it was for a Gardner Denver air compressor. So I thought to myself, this is probably not a very big, change in price. It's probably very minimal. But I went ahead and followed up on it. I contacted the manufacturer in St. Louis, who said that they had sent the equipment to a distributor in California. I contacted that distributor in California, and they said that they had sold it to the consultant, in fact. And they were able to provide me with an original invoice. Lo and behold, that invoice had been marked up about 25% or about $2,000. So something that was seemingly small, just one type of air compressor versus another type of air compressor, does make a difference. So what happens when we do these investigations? What are the consequences of fraud? Well, I want to read for you Penal Code 115A. And I'm paraphrasing, of course. Penal Code 115A says everyone who knowingly submits a false or forged document to the state is guilty of a felony. So be careful here. As the grantees, I understand sometimes it may not be you that's doing the work. You may be getting these bills from other people, putting these together in packages, but there's still responsibility there. This is an example of a case that the Fraud, Waste, and Abuse Prevention Unit worked on recently, and it's still ongoing. This is a press release issued on May 2012. And here we have criminal charges that have been filed against a consulting company. As part of the criminal charges, the consultant's multi-million-dollar house in Santa Barbara was searched. Their vacation home in a ski area was also searched. They were arrested. They spent the weekend in jail, and they're currently facing up to 5 years in state prison. And in addition to that, the Attorney General's office has also filed civil charges. So there's 2 cases that are going forward on this. If you suspect that there's fraud going on, you should contact your grant manager. You can also, if you have questions about specific invoices and how you can follow up on those, you can talk to your grant manager. You can also give me a call. The next slide's going to have my email address if you want to get in contact with me. If you think that there's fraud going on, we also have a unit, the Fraud, Waste, and Abuse Prevention Unit, that follows up on that. And there's 3 ways that you can contact us. We have an email, reportfraud@waterboards.ca.gov. We have a toll-free message line, and we also have a complaint form that you can fill out. Now, the complaint form can be submitted to us by mail, by fax, or by email. You can talk to us anonymously. You can call me. You don't have to tell me what your name is. You can ask questions about invoices. I've had at least 3 people set up email addresses, Jane Doe or John Doe at gmail.com, and submit emails that way to ask questions so that they could remain anonymous. And again, we will honor that. So there's my contact information. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Kim. I really appreciate that. And that kind of brings us full circle. We've kind of laid out our reporting process, your requirements, how we're going to handle invoicing. And I think the main thing for you to understand is we have 2 purposes here. we're going to try and help you get your project completed by reimbursing you. And our other job is to protect the taxpayers. So don't ever forget that we are trying to help you. We do consider it part of our job and our duty, but we also have a duty to the taxpayers. So when we ask you questions, we're trying to understand your process, we're trying to understand your project, and we're trying to make sure that we're doing our due diligence to make sure that the taxpayers are getting the most for their money. So I wanted to briefly introduce your grant managers and, more importantly, your program analysts who have not actually been up here talking. And do we have a microphone? Or so I think I'm just going to, so that Kelly's going to walk around, you can at least hear their name if the camera doesn't go with her. So that you can see these are going to be your program analyst or your grant managers, and this will give you a face to go with the name and the email. Come on, Carolyn.
My name's Carolyn Saputo, and I'm the grant analyst for Regions 1, 4, IRWM, and Region 3.
For Region 6, 7, and statewide, and also the cleanup. Oh, and also ASBS.
That was Melissa Miller signing for us.
Yeah, I said, yeah, I already mentioned my name, Melissa. I didn't know we weren't on the mic yet, so sorry about that.
Hi, my name is Michelle Stebbins, and I am the program analyst for Region 2, 5, 8, 9, and UCs.
And Barbara Walton is sitting over there, and she's our lead analyst, okay? Yeah, so she actually is kind of our go-to person when we're unsure, is this okay or is this how we should do this? We ask Barbara. And I think you've met all of the staff that you will be dealing with on the implementation, except for Danielle Siebel. She's in Europe, so you can't meet her. Boo-hoo, huh? All right, so we're going to wrap this up unless there are any other questions. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in out there. We hope you all tuned in out there. And if you think of something later, email us, call us. We promise to answer the phone and try and answer your questions. And thanks again.